As we've gone through this lesson together, we've been talking about a variety of different topics that centered in on trying to manage our way through the haze. We've talked about what it means to go through suffering. We've talked about crying out to God and trying to embrace the unknown and holding on to our integrity. We've talked about a lot of these ways for us to manage it, but it's kind of come to our attention that, in a sense, there's kind of a potential gaping hole in all of the things that we've been talking about. And that gaping hole comes in the form of mental health. It very well could be that one of the greatest struggles that people are dealing with right now during this time is that of some very serious mental health issues.
All of us have those bouts with what we would call general melancholy. But there is a growing concern within our country, across the world, that people are battling depression, anxiety, and other disorders and other problems that go well beyond the general melancholy that we often feel. In fact, as we look at various articles and reports that are coming out, WebMD on August 13th had this to say, published this report. The pandemic is taking a big toll on American psyches. A new government report found that about 41% of adults surveyed in late June reported an adverse mental or behavioral health condition. That's a big rise from 2019. For example, the data shows that the number of Americans suffering from an anxiety disorder had tripled by late June compared to the same time last year. And the number of those with depression had jumped fourfold. We continue to find in this report that even concerns and serious considerations of suicide are going way, way up. This is a concern that we as Christians do not need to be hiding from. We do not need to be ignoring it. Today we begin a two-part lesson in which Brett and I sit down with John and Carla Moore. John and Carla are both affiliated with the Bear Valley Bible Institute. John as an instructor, Carla as the Dean of Women's Studies. We sat down with these two because while they are not licensed counselors, while they are not trained clinicians, they have over 30 years of experience in reading, studying, and some level of training and counseling that gives them a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience to draw from in this realm of mental health.
And so as we sat down with this discussion with them, this is more of a discussion format as opposed to a Bible study format, because they both have unique experience, Carla specifically with women and John, of course, with men, and both of them together with couples. And so we didn't want to ignore this. We didn't want to pass by this because it's serious and it's needed. And we wanted to make sure that this is something that we covered in our Through the Haze series. So thank you for joining us for this two-part series with John and Carla Moore as we study mental health through the haze.
John, Carla, we are so grateful to have you with us in this discussion. Brett and I, as we pondered this class, suffering and knowing with COVID-19 just wreaking havoc on people's lives in so many ways right now, it occurred to us that somewhere along the way we needed to touch on, even if just briefly, the reality of depression in people's lives. And so we thought of you two coming in to work with us. And I want to give you a moment to kind of tell folks who may not know who you are a little bit about yourselves. Before we do that, just an asterisk, a caveat on this. John and Carla are not licensed counselors. We want to make sure that you understand that, but they are a wonderful, godly couple who have a lot of ministry experience, and they do have training in this field to some degree and a lot of experience to draw from, certainly more than Brett and I do, which is why we reached out to you. So guys, tell us a little bit about what you do in your ministries and a little bit of your background from a counseling or life coaching standpoint.
Well, we've been involved in ministry, I guess, for about 30 years. I've seen various facets of it. Campus ministry, we worked at a local congregation in Dripping Springs, Texas for 18 years. Um, Taught at a school of preaching in Austin. Now, of course, we're here at the Bear Valley Bible Institute. Uh, we like to tell people that we're kind of a jack of all trades and maybe a master of none, but we do have some interesting experiences with people. We love people. My educational background involves a master's degree in counseling, and after I was awarded my master's degree, I decided I really want to go into ministry full time, and I never did pursue my license to do it. But I've used a lot of what I learned in ministry, and one of the things that we were most interested in is as we discussed and analyzed and thought about all of the secular psychology that's in the world. Is there a biblical psychology? Is there a way that God looks at human beings? And that's what we try to do, is to marry those two, to take the things that were good out of our background and experiences, look at God's Word, and then use those to try to help people.
Uh, Carla, from your side of this, you are that great helpmeet for John. From what I understand, you really have a lot of life experience and just working beside him and helping to interact with people.
Right. We've done a lot of counseling together, premarital, postmarital, but most of my, I guess, what you would call experience just comes from sitting with people and listening, sitting with women, of course, and listening and trying to just empathize and understand where they are and be transparent in my own struggles and my own feelings about things. And so that, to me, that's what I try to do, is just to give encouragement and support and maybe be an advocate for someone who needs help in any way.
A great blessing, something that so many people need. As we move into this, one of the things that we want to get your thoughts on is the stigma that so often comes with mental health, depression, and whatnot. This really is something that, in my experience, churches and Christians in general have struggled to figure out how to respond to properly. So I guess to get your first thought of this on this, would you agree that there has been at times a stigma upon those who battle depression and whatnot? And if there is, why do you think that's there?
Well, I think probably a couple of reasons. One is that no one likes to feel as though that their life is unstable. You know, we like to think that we have it all sort of managed, and there's this, I guess, facade that we sometimes have that we project to people. We like people to think that we've got it all together, and then when all of a sudden that sort of vision of ourself or stereotype is shattered by the reality of life, then we maybe lose a little bit of self-esteem. Maybe we go to church and we see that people are happy and they greet us, and all we see maybe is their life right here at the building, and we don't know what's going on in their own homes, and so we don't recognize it and realize that there are a lot of people who are struggling, and they just don't know it. Now, having grown up in ministry, her dad was a preacher, my dad was an elder, my grandfather, we've known about the problems. We realize for years, as a little boy, I sat up at the church building waiting on my dad to get out of meetings. And while they never divulged to us the specifics of things, as I grew up, I began to realize people are struggling. People have problems. Just number one, people don't know about it. But I think the second thing as to why maybe there's a stigma is because we maybe some have been told that to be a good Christian, you've got to be happy all the time. And they read Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. And then when they recognize in their own life that maybe there are times they're not happy, then they sort of draw this conclusion that, well, maybe I'm not a very good Christian. What's wrong? I don't have enough faith. Maybe they've even heard people from the pulpit say, the reason that you are struggling is because you're not praying enough, you're not reading enough. And they've got this flawed theology about how we need to handle our problems, and they don't really read the entirety of Scripture to know that depression, that problems in life, is typical for many of God's people. So I don't know, Carla, you may want to add something to that, and I've got some other things I want to share, but
I think maybe it's increased over the last several decades because, you have the greatest generation before, and they tended to power through. But I think they still struggle so much, and we just didn't know about it. But maybe that was more of a mindset back in the prior generations. But with social media and keeping up with the Joneses, as they say, I think there's just so much more in the world right now that has tended to lead to depression and anxiety and all those things. So I think there's just more of it now. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe.
Well, having worked with teens, I mean, I'm seeing it as a dramatic increase, especially with the younger people. I asked a question to the teens not too long ago, maybe about a year ago. I said, "How often are you encountering somebody who is depressed or having some sort of suicidal feelings?" And they're saying nearly daily that they're encountering this. And so that has changed the dynamic of what people are dealing with behind the scenes. And like you said, with the social media, not only is it keeping up with the Joneses, but everybody that is presenting themselves on social media as this wonderful life.
Highlight reel.
And people feel like, well, I'm not that. Behind the scenes, I knew who I really am, and I'm not that. And so therefore, I'm depressed, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me.
John, you mentioned what has often been said from pulpits that really all you need a stronger prayer life, you need more Bible time, those kinds of things. I recall, and we've talked about this before, I recall of a professor at one of our sister schools getting up one time in chapel, and he said, for a long time I was that guy. I was the one who said that to have depression, if you were battling depression, it meant that you weren't strong enough spiritually. He said, I believed that until the day that I had to be driven to a facility because I was battling something that I had never experienced before. And he changed his tune very much and became an advocate for a better understanding of depression. And so I guess one of the things that I would maybe lay out to think is, why does this stigma exist for some? For a lot of people, it's because we've never experienced it. It is definitely much more widespread, as we are saying now, or at least whether it's more widespread or we are just more aware of it, I'm not sure which one, but there are still numerous people who have either never had to deal with it on their own or they've not had a family member yet to have to go through it. And so sometimes when you just flat out don't understand, I would say that leads to potential stigma.
Yeah, and I feel like it doesn't fit, to use the buzzword in our day and time, the narrative, right? Here is the narrative of a Christian. Do this, do this, do this, and everything is going to be perfect in your life. Well, theologically, that's just not biblically sound, right? God reminds us that a part of this life is going to encompass pain and challenges and difficulty. And if we begin to look down through Scripture, we're going to see that there are a lot of people who struggle with what we would call today clinical depression. They may have been depressed at times, just like some of us are depressed, and maybe we can talk more about that later on. But then there is what the American Psychiatric Association has called true clinical depression. So if you look at those people in the Bible, people like Jeremiah and numerous statements that he made about what was going to happen to God's people, I mean, that stimulus, that information, is one means of causing depression in people, and all that they're hearing cognitively affected him. I think about Elijah as a great example, 1 Kings 18 and 19. Several components brought about his depression, which I think he was depressed, right? He was in the cave, he pulled his mantle up over his head, What did he say? Which is one of the characteristics of depression is suicidal ideations, thinking about, I want to die. There are people who have felt that way. And he certainly got to that point because of a lack of food, because of things that he was hearing, information. He isolated himself, the classic sort of thing that sometimes we run through in talking about people that become depressed. So whether it's Elijah or Jeremiah, I think about Job, I think about Jonah. Jonah, well, he wanted to die, right? And 2 times he mentions that in the book.
David in the Psalms.
Great, yeah. In fact, Psalm 38 is a tremendous psalm that really tells us, he says, my bones, it hurts down deep. My body feels it. And there's this description of really, in a lot of ways, clinical depression. That was because of the sin that he committed, and he didn't know maybe how to deal with it or overcome it in some ways. And so there are a lot of things that contribute to it. But yeah, first of all, there are people who've experienced it, biblical times, certainly today. And I appreciate you bringing up the man that you did a moment ago, because in our ministry, we have found over the years that this is a real problem, that there are Christians, strong Christian people, I want to emphasize that, strong Christian people who have struggled with bouts of depression. And I don't mean, again, just feelings of melancholy that maybe we all get, but really have maybe had some sort of diagnoses, some chemical imbalance that has created this mood and this situation in their life that they can't overcome or having a hard time overcoming.
And a lot of times, too, in their depression, they're not separated from God. They're still walking with the Lord. I've heard that many times from people that they still feel that kinship, that relationship with God. Maybe they feel like that God has pulled away from them some, but I think it's important to know that it's not always that they are separated from God during their depression. They still feel His presence and know that He's there, but it's maybe in some ways that hurts them even more just to know that they are hurting even in His presence.
So you mentioned, you talk about the APA and having those characteristics of depression. Let's focus on that here for just a moment. Can you describe for us a little bit, how does somebody know, or what are some of the symptoms that somebody needs to be looking for of actual depression? How do you distinguish between general melancholy and actual depression that somebody might need to reach out and get some help for?
Well, I think the first thing, and this was something that I learned in class years ago, and that is that all of us more or less experience forms of melancholy, depression, or whatever. We may at times feel like we don't want to get out of bed. We just want to isolate ourselves. Maybe at times because we're sad about something, we lose our appetite, or maybe we turn to comfort food, and eat. There are always, I guess, in every person, times in which we just maybe don't feel good about ourselves. Maybe we have a sense of dread about the world. Okay? Well, those are all, quote, normal, because I think a lot of the population experiences those. In abnormal psychology, psychologists say, well, how do we figure out when someone is, quote, depressed in a way that becomes really dangerous, or maybe is creating some problems, low productivity and so forth. And they say that when people begin to experience those things on a longer period and greater amounts, so in other words, it's outside the normal sort of baseline of things. Which, by the way, for a Christian, we all need to know that being sad is a part of living the Christian life. We ought to be sad about certain things. We ought to cry, okay? We ought to feel depressed in that sense because of what's happening in our world. But when those things are happening over a long period of time, these so-called episodes, where you see it maybe 2 weeks or longer, and they just stay there and they remain, or when you begin to see that it has lowered your productivity such that you're not efficient in what you're doing at work or at home, or here's another one, when it begins to affect your relationships, okay, where's Dad? Well, isn't he going with us to the ball game? No, he's not. And then tomorrow, what isn't Dad going with us to church? No, he's not going to church. After a while, there's an absence. Where are they? All of those to me are huge red flags that ought to be, indicators that these are some things that maybe you need to seek some help with and to find out about whether or not you check off all the boxes that maybe if you go to a medical doctor, they're going to kind of go down the list that's been established by the APA. They're probably going to have the diagnostic statistical manual, the DSMR. It's been revised several years, but the APA put that together and they have this checklist, and so they're going to go down through that. And then usually if you go to a psychiatrist or just a therapist of any type, those are the things they're going to start doing, and then they may go through a period of assessment and talk about know your family history. So that's kind of step 2 in the process. But maybe to answer your question first, those are some things I think that you might consider red flags. Carla, can you think of any others?
The feelings of hopelessness and just a lack of any feeling of purpose or hope beyond the next hour, just not wanting to get out of bed, wanting to stay at home, not go anywhere. I think that's a big one of just wanting to stay at home and curl up into a little ball. I've heard that many times. I just want to curl up into a ball and disappear. Things like that. Sleeping a lot. Just those.
It's interesting, going back to the Elijah story, the anatomy of that particular scenario there. Think about what happened. He was on this tremendous high. And then, he just won the battle at Mount Carmel. And now all of a sudden, someone's seeking to take his life. I mean, life throws at us sometimes these big roller coaster kinds of experiences, and it can just really knock us off balance, right? It's our equilibrium is now totally shifted. And here he was, right? Everything's great. And then sometimes, by the way, in those really wonderful, awesome experiences, we become emotionally depleted. And that can happen. That happens with preachers sometimes. They go through ministry for years, and they're on this high, and then all of a sudden some bad things happen, and they just become exhausted emotionally. And I want to come back to that in a minute, by the way. So then what does he do? He runs away from it, okay, which I understand. That's characteristic of any of us. I don't want to be in that bad situation, especially when my life is threatened. So he went out into the wilderness, and then he evidently quit eating. And physiologically, that has an impact on us, right? Our diet, physiological, has a huge impact on the emotional and the psychological. And then he goes further into the wilderness, and he isolates himself, and he goes into a cave. And then here's another big one, and this is where maybe it's one of those red flags. Faulty thinking. Faulty thinking. Am I starting to see the world in a very negative way? Or do I feel like people are out to get me? Paranoia. Do I feel uncomfortable around crowds? And that was Elijah. What did he say? I'm the only one. Mm-hmm. If you ever tell yourself, I'm the only one, no one cares about me, hear yourself say that. Because even though, again, we're not trying to beat ourselves up anymore about, you're thinking faulty, but do some self-talk and ask yourself, is that really true? And in fact, in counseling circles, I used to tell clients to do a lot of this self-talk. Talk to yourself and say, and talk out loud, is that really true? Is that really right? Are they, start thinking about the good things about this person or this situation. But anyway, in other words, we start thinking things that aren't true, because remember how God corrected his faulty thinking. No, I've got 4,000. We get the number right?
It was 7,000.
7,000. There you go. Even more. Yeah? They haven't bowed the knee to Baal. All right. Good to have a Bible scholar here. 7,000 haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And so that tells us that in our periods of depression, we don't always think right. We don't see the world from a correct perspective. One, I'm the only one. God says, no, 7,000. So anyway, those are some important
Along
things.
those lines, too, I think it's important for people who are close to people who are starting to go down this slope to recognize some of these things and maybe point them out. Because if you're in the middle of faulty thinking, if you can't see for yourself what's going on, it's important to recognize some of these signs. And when you think something's just not right, and it may not be a spouse necessarily, but a friend, but we might think I'm not going to say anything because maybe there's nothing wrong, or maybe it's me. But I think we really, when we start seeing some of these things, just different patterns, that's when we can say, are you okay? Or something going on? Or how are you doing? And as a friend yesterday said, how are you really doing? So I think it's good for us to check in with people.
Well, and I to that point, I know of one family that they had to strike an agreement between the spouses. The husband had had some battles with this, and so at one point his wife said, I need you to agree that you are going to give me permission to tell you that this is happening again if this starts to happen, when you start showing these kinds of things. Because one of the things I hear you describing is we're talking a rather drastic turn in behavior. Is one of those red flags that if you are normally an upbeat or level-headed kind of person, but all of a sudden over the course of a period of a couple of weeks or more, it seems like there's some duration that has to come with this, you start having a turn in the personality, that becomes one of those concerns that you have to be able to identify. And so that's one of the things that this particular couple had to do is say, I need you to give me the permission to let you know when I'm seeing this. Mm-hmm. And that you're not going to get mad at me, because you're going to promise to listen when we discuss that.
Well, that's such a great point. I think it really speaks to, maybe we're getting here a little further than you wanted to go at this point, but how important it is in a family dynamic or in a church dynamic of people really watching out for each other. Because we may not, as Carla said, see it in ourselves always. Mm-hmm. We may not feel like things are right, but we can't put our finger on it, whatever. But we really need to be watchful to see about changes in behaviors of others. It may not even be indicative of depression. It might be that someone is having problems with drug use. That's another thing, right? Huge mood swings, or maybe they just isolate themselves. Their personality is different. Those should be red flags that something may not be right here. So ask questions, figure it out. Go to it. First, start off with a medical doctor. Do whatever we need to do. But when we start seeing those major changes, like you said, then let's start asking some questions of each other, of ourselves, and recognize these things.
Yeah.
Would you say that there are times that it's subtle enough to where you have the slow changes that until you're down the road for a bit and you really look back 6 months ago, you don't realize the drastic change, that there may be that can be kind of how the depression has set in, is a little bit more slow, a little bit more subtle, almost kind of like the watching paint dry or a boiling pot. It feels slow and subtle over time. Have you noticed some things in your experience that maybe went more along that route?
Well, and again, we don't want y'all to think that we're experts on this at all, or licensed, but our experiences in dealing with people, things that they reported to us, what we've noticed in others, that is a lot of how it happens. And or maybe people have just rocked along with it over the course of their life, right? And have found various ways to cope with it, or they kind of were up and down. But then some precipitating event, as it's sometimes called, all of a sudden sends them down. And when they never got help before all of those years, they just sort of rocked along and existed. Then this major event happened in their life. Maybe it was the loss of a loved one. Maybe it was some physiological issue. They're in the hospital, or marital problems or whatever, and or change environment. They've moved somewhere, and now, then it just sort of bottoms out on them, whatever. But so that can happen. But then also, yes, it can get worse. So I hate to.
I think most of the time, people are hanging on by their fingernails, and we just don't know it. And they've been existing and maybe trying to portray that they're doing fine, and then all of a sudden, it seems like they've taken a downturn, but it's really something that's been gradual.
So what about this? You guys having the amount of experience that you have, can you give us maybe a couple of practical examples? We're kind of talking about this a little bit. Is there anything else you could share, like maybe practical examples where you've witnessed some of this happening? Obviously not compromising anybody's identity or anything like that at all, but
yeah, I mean, it's there's been a wide range of things, I guess. I think of people who've had trauma in their life, maybe dealing with some sexual abuse, emotional abuse as children, and they just sort of buried it, and it just rocked along, and then it came out as an adult in a larger way. So we've had friends that in that situation, others that fell into a bout of depression because of their work. In some ways, panic disorders, anxiety disorders can be interrelated to this. And if you've thought about panic disorders, and I didn't learn about this till several years ago, but some of those come from the fact that our mind, and this is what we need to remember to help people as well, to think about the physiological part of it. Our mind is like a muscle. It can be overused sometimes. And, if you went out and you played tennis and you swing the racket all the time, which I hate tennis, I don't, let's say baseball. How about baseball? You swing the bat, swing the bat, and you keep swinging it, right? What's happened? You're gonna get sore. Well, tennis, I like that because we get the so-called tennis elbow. You keep using it, right? And all of a sudden, then you've got to have some therapy, and because there is a physiological problem here. Well, we have mental illnesses sometimes that come. And sometimes it comes because of a chemical imbalance that's been there that we've just, sort of dealt with, or maybe it's exacerbated because of food, our diet's off, our sleep is off, or whatever. And so, all of a sudden, all of that accentuates the problem. So that happens. But sometimes our mind can just become so weary, and that's what happens with anxiety disorders and panic disorders. That people don't let their mind rest. I've seen this in some older men. I want to mention this as well because even though, again, it's a little different issue with anxiety and depression, but anxiety is a part of it. Two different men that I knew, one was a member of the church, one was not, that came to me and said, I don't know what's wrong with me. Both of them were highly successful in their businesses. Both of them thought that the whole thing about anxiety and panic and all that was just a bunch of hooey, and that was all for weak-minded people, whatever. And then it happened to them. Mm-hmm. And there were several precipitating events that brought it on, but they began to realize and had to learn that this whole mind up here can become ill. Mental illness shouldn't be stigmatized. It should be thought of as a real physiological thing that we sometimes have to deal with. So anyway, I know it maybe kind of got off a little bit from where we were, but
something I've noticed, this is a little bit different, but and it's a very unprofessional, non-professional opinion, but it seems that people who are very sympathetic, very empathetic, those who feel very deeply are ones who tend to have trouble with this. I don't know, I know that's not across the board, but people that I know well who love and they care so deeply about people. And I think sometimes they just take so much in, and they're caregivers, and they care so much, and maybe it just gets to be too much for them. Also, some people who feel like they've got to live up to everyone's expectations or have such high expectations of themselves, they tend to feel like they've let themselves down, let everyone else down. So that's just something I've observed.
Yeah, but I think to answer your question as well, I was just trying to remember, you're right, people that feel, we've run into people like that. I said we've ministered, helped, been involved, or people that have shared with us their experiences. Preachers, successful business people, parents, maybe someone who's been in a bad relationship. And so it's, it doesn't discriminate.
It's people all across the board, I think, is kind of what we're getting at. And so no matter where you are in life, sometimes that may even be an additional stigma, is your place in life, or even the way that you, have viewed your success. You feel like, I should be exempt. I should not be depressed. I'm happy. I have everything's lining up for me.
I have everything I need. Everything should be good.
And that adds to it.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's happening. They can still deal with depression.
And I'm sorry, let me mention this before I forget, is that you're right. All groups, I can think about some young people, Teenagers, you mentioned that earlier. You mentioned preachers. I can think about, there's another group that we forget about, and that's the elderly. Think about how much changes in their life, and especially if there's the loss of a spouse. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a difference between grieving and sadness and depression, and they're diagnosed differently, but one certainly can feed the other, and you can go from grief and sadness and the struggles of that, and then it puts you into depression. And so we want to make sure, just because you've lost a loved one and you're grieving, you're sad, doesn't mean that you would be diagnosed with clinical depression, but it can grow into that if we're not careful. My point is that, yeah, we've seen a lot of that, and in our limited experiences, again, non-professional people. But
so, John, we're kind of jumping around with a lot of different possible symptoms or people that could deal with these symptoms. But if you were to kind of give us maybe more of a summary of some of these symptoms that they might be watching out for, what would maybe be a summary of some of these?
Well, I mentioned the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders published by the APA. Let me just share with you that list of things. I've got it here. And we've already mentioned several things, but again, feeling sad or having a depressed mood. And I said, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, I guess sometimes people feel blue, they have feelings of dread, helplessness, hopelessness, despair. Those were my things, just to qualify that, they didn't have that in there. But loss of interest or pleasure in activities once enjoyed, changes in appetite, weight loss or gain unrelated to dieting, okay? Trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, loss of energy or increased fatigue, increase in purposelessness, physical activity, or purposeful physical activity, the inability to sit still. Maybe you're constantly pacing, hand-wringing, slowed movements or speech. These actions must be severe enough to be observable by others, though. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty thinking, concentrating, or making decisions, thoughts of death or suicide. And I put in here making sure that we do talk a little bit about the difference between suicidal ideations and suicidal intent. It's not totally outside the spectrum of normal thinking for us to say, I'm tired of this life. I mentioned earlier in our discussion that some of the great Bible people of faith said things like that. Probably at some point in our life, every one of us said, I'm just so tired of this, I just want to end it, And maybe in a fit of anger or rage, we said that. All right, that's one thing. Then there's the other one where we're maybe really thinking about it, really have the ideations and,
A plan you're talking about.
Well, no, then go to the plan. But yeah, in other words, I sort of say, first one is we all say, man, I'm just so tired of this. Lord, come take me now. Mm-hmm. Then there's okay, I'm thinking about this. It would be better for me to be not here anymore.
Is that more of what you mean by ideation? Yeah. It's when you start giving more legitimate thought to, it would really be better if I just weren't here.
Yeah, and maybe a lot of people experience that, but that's one of the symptoms, I think, associated with it. Ought to be a red flag. And then, of course, it can become more severe with ideation, with the suicidal intent. When you start planning, okay, here's how I'm going to do it. Or maybe going through the process of getting whatever the items are that you're going to use in the process, which, by the way, is the way people evaluate the lethality or the severity of someone who's going to maybe think about or has said that they're going to commit suicide. Well, how lethal is it? What have they done? Where are they in that process? But anyway, I wanted to mention that because we don't want to forget that comes into people's minds. And again, we need to talk about those things and get them out in the open and realize it's very important to discuss it.
I'm so grateful to John and Carla and being able to sit at their feet and learn from their years of knowledge, experience, and study. You can really tell that this is something that they've put a lot of time and effort into. Right. And so we so greatly appreciate the time that we've had. And of course, we still have part 2 coming up.
One of the things that we want to make available to you as you are watching and listening, you hear us mention some various resources that are available. Some this week, you'll hear about some next week. We want to make sure that you have those resources at your fingertips. In the comments or description of this video, you will find links to various websites, various organizations that we feel like could be helpful. Whether you want to just further educate yourself with regards to mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, and the like, or if you are in a position in which you need help and you're trying to figure out who you can reach out to. We want these things to be available to you, but even with the links down in the site, we want you to also remember that we're here. We love you. God loves you. We want to pray with you. We want to be that shoulder for you to lean upon. And we promise, Brett and I are not experts in any of this. We understand that we have our limits, and so what we can also be is a resource that if we realize that you need help beyond what we know how to give, then we want to be able to connect you with somebody who can help. And so please don't hesitate. Figure out a way to reach out so that we can provide the love of Jesus to you in every way that we possibly can.
It truly would be our pleasure to be a resource to you or be a help to you. If we can, certainly, I want to echo what he just said. We want to be there to help. Thank you very much for joining us as we studied mental health through the Haze. Please join us next week as we get into part 2 and get a little bit more into the practical side of this mental health and more of what we can do and where we can go. Join us next week as we study mental health through the Haze.